Most people think they are escaping boredom when they reach for their phone. That is usually the explanation they give themselves. There is nothing happening. The room is quiet. The mind wants stimulation, so it looks for something to occupy itself with. But boredom turns out to be a strangely incomplete explanation for what actually happens when a person is left alone with nothing except themselves. Because if this were only boredom, an unpleasant but harmless emptiness, then an odd finding from modern psychology becomes difficult to explain. Researchers place people in a room with almost nothing to do. No conversations, no screens, no distractions, just time and their own thoughts. Then they gave them a choice. Sit there quietly for a short period or press a button and receive a mild but genuinely unpleasant electric shock. A surprising number of people pressed the button, not because they enjoyed it, not because they were curious. Many had already said they would willingly pay money to avoid receiving the shock, and yet they chose pain over stillness. That should stop you for a moment because it raises a much more unsettling question than whether people get bored easily. What exactly is inside the mind that makes discomfort feel preferable to listening to it? The 90-second problem. The study came from psychologist Timothy Wilson and colleagues at the University of Virginia in 2014. Participants across multiple experiments were asked to sit alone in an empty room for periods ranging from 6 to 15 minutes. No phones, no reading material, no music, no tasks, nothing except unstructured thought. The findings repeated themselves with remarkable consistency. Participants described the experience as unexpectedly unpleasant. Attention drifted constantly. Thoughts scattered. People struggled to remain focused even for a few minutes. And in the version of the study that became widely discussed, participants were given access to a button that would deliver a small electric shock. Roughly a quarter chose to use it. Some chose it multiple times. Wilson's conclusion was not that people hate thinking. Human beings spend enormous portions of their lives thinking voluntarily. The conclusion was narrower and more unsettling. People seem uncomfortable being left alone with a mind that has no structure around it, not thinking itself, just thinking without somewhere to put it. What the mind does when no one is using it. To understand why this happens, it helps to examine what the brain actually does when nothing external demands attention. Neuroscientist Marcus Raichle identified a collection of brain regions that become active specifically during rest, periods where attention is not directed toward a particular task. This network later became known as the default mode network. What makes the name slightly misleading is that default does not mean inactive. In many situations, the brain becomes more active when it appears to be doing nothing. The network specializes in self-referential activity, revisiting old experiences, simulating possible futures, reconstructing narratives about who you are and what your life means. This process is not pathological. It is fundamental to identity itself. But research by psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard found something important about what happens when minds wander freely. Using real-time sampling across thousands of participants, they found that people's minds drifted away from the present task a remarkable amount of the time, often somewhere between 30 and 50% of waking life. And during most forms of mind wandering, people reported being less happy. The mind left alone does not naturally settle into silence. It begins processing, and what it processes is often unfinished. Old conversations replayed with better responses, regrets examined from new angles. Imagine futures rehearsed repeatedly as though anticipation could somehow create safety. Stillness does not create these things. Stillness simply removes what was covering them. Aloneness is not loneliness. This is where discussions about solitude often become confused. Psychiatrist Anthony Storr argued that loneliness and solitude, although frequently treated as identical, describe fundamentally different states. Loneliness is painful disconnection. It is wanting closeness and not having it. Solitude is something else entirely. Solitude is chosen separation, a deliberate stepping away from constant interaction in order to access something that endless company often prevents. Storr observed that the ability to tolerate and even value solitude appears unevenly distributed among people. Some seem capable of sitting comfortably inside long periods of aloneness, while others experience profound restlessness almost immediately. Part of that difference may come from early experience, A child who experiences time alone as safety develops a different relationship to silence than a child who experiences aloneness as abandonment. Eventually, what appears in adulthood as preference may actually be memory operating beneath awareness. Not all forms of alone feel the same, and the nervous system remembers which version arrived first. The discomfort people experience in silence is rarely about silence itself. It is about what silence stops suppressing. Constant input functions as a kind of low-level filtration system. Notifications, conversations, work, entertainment, endless information moving across attention. These things do not necessarily resolve internal material. They often simply prevent access to it. Remove the input and something else becomes audible. Grief, regret, fear, unresolved questions. Things postponed long enough to become background noise. For someone carrying significant emotional weight, stillness can feel strangely similar to exposure. Because the mind does not suddenly invent difficult material during quiet moments, it simply stops hiding it. This changes the meaning of the discomfort entirely. The urge to escape silence is not necessarily evidence of shallowness or weakness. It may simply be information. The discomfort itself may be pointing toward something unfinished, something waiting, something that has been speaking quietly for years beneath all the noise, when aloneness becomes too much. At the far end of the spectrum, the story changes. Research on prolonged solitary confinement by psychologist Craig Haney and studies involving extreme isolation environments, polar expeditions, submarines, sensory deprivation, found that long periods of imposed isolation can have serious psychological effects. Anxiety increases, perception becomes unstable. In some cases, people experience hallucinations or disruptions in their ordinary sense of self. This matters because solitude is not automatically healing simply because it is solitude. Dose matters. Choice matters. Context matters. Brief and voluntary solitude often creates space for reflection and clarity. Extreme prolonged isolation can destabilize the very systems reflection depends on. Between those two extremes exists most ordinary human experience, which means there is no universal amount of solitude that works equally for everyone. There is only the question of what your particular mind can tolerate and what it might be trying to tell you. Not everyone finds stillness unbearable. Across history, contemplative traditions developed entire practices around prolonged silence and solitude. Early Christian desert fathers, Buddhist retreat traditions, solitary hermits, many recognized something familiar long before modern psychology began measuring it. The Desert Fathers even had a word for the restlessness that often emerged in isolation. Acedia, a kind of agitation, despair, and resistance that surfaced when the mind was first asked to remain still. They recognized something Wilson's experiments would later reveal. The untrained mind does not settle quietly. It resists. But they also observed something else. With repeated exposure, the relationship changes. Stillness becomes less threatening. The room becomes less crowded, not because thoughts disappear, because the person sitting with them stops running. The discomfort of being alone with your own mind is not proof that something is uniquely wrong with you. It appears to be remarkably common enough that some people choose physical discomfort over 15 minutes of unstructured thought. What changes from person to person is not whether discomfort exists, it is what the discomfort contains. Silence does not create the contents of your mind. It reveals them. Everything that surfaces in stillness was already there, moving quietly beneath distractions that kept it hidden from view. And maybe the question is not how to spend your life outrunning whatever appears when the noise disappears. Maybe the question is whether you have finally reached a point where it might be safe enough to listen until the silence finds you again.